Hi guys, the title of the title you see on the screen today. Don't forget to like and subscribe and we'll get started.
The story begins in a dark office where many different paintings of women have been brought in for one man. The butler who did it approached him and said that these were the works of a rising star in the art world. He also added that they had recently received high praise and even won an award at an exhibition at the Academy of Arts. The man suddenly waved his hand and said that this particular part depicted the goddess of the moon, and that by combining the inviolable divinity and the habitual desires of humanity, it resulted in this magnificent painting. However, his master suddenly hit the chair with his hand and, turning to Tris, told him to shut up. The man immediately bowed, asked for his forgiveness, and said that he felt that their preparation was insufficient since he didn't like something. And at that moment, the butler himself thought that he was so confident about this day because he had prepared very hard in order not to make any mistakes. However, in the end, everything went wrong, and the butler even wondered what kind of work of art could possibly satisfy such a person. Its owner and boss was Marcus, Demius de Train, and his tastes were not superior to those of any art collector. Tris, laughing a little, said that in that case he thought the man had seen enough for the day, so he thought all those pictures should be removed. But he asked that they address them as they always do, and that there be no exceptions. The butler, hearing this, immediately bowed and said that in that case he would prepare him to be sent to the estate. In fact, as always, this man buys all the pieces on display, and as the curator of this gallery, he cannot deny that he is a valuable patron of it. Marcus, of course, is not interested in the fame of a work of art or the potential for the artist's declining prospects. His only interest lies in the themes of these works themselves. And the themes of these paintings were quite interesting. They were naked women who looked elegant in some cases and even vulgar in others. The butler, who gave him various choices, could not understand why he was so obsessed with nude art. However, such curiosity always led to trouble, so he just silently did the assigned work. Marcus stood silently and watched as his new painting was packed up to be sent to his palace. But then suddenly he noticed something interesting. It was one painting, again with a half-naked woman, and he wondered what it was. The butler laughed nervously and said that this part was below standard, so they decided not to show it to him. But Marcus said in an angry voice that they should remove the cape and show it. The servants immediately obeyed, and when they removed the canvas, the beautiful woman who was depicted there was visible. The butler, still smiling, said that as Marcus could already see, the brushstrokes seemed rough and unpolished, so they had decided to simply not show him the painting. The man also said that the model has an impressive figure, but there was a degree of awkwardness that made the piece of art uncomfortable. Marcus just stood silently and watched this picture. He was practically devouring it with his gaze. In conclusion, the butler said that this was not at all the kind of work that would interest the Marquis, so they decided to put it off. But the man, completely ignoring his words, only asked the name of the artist who painted her. His servant was very worried, immediately went to the papers to look at the name. He said that she had not yet officially debuted, and he would confirm and send him the details immediately as soon as he knew everything himself. Marcus, meanwhile, slowly approached the painting, which depicted a naked woman. He really liked her, so he wanted to know who this artist was. At this very time, in the estate that belonged to the Baroness, a girl was walking along the corridors and talking with her teacher. She had blonde hair and told her teacher that her parents had become so into collecting art lately, and because of this, their house no longer looked like a home, but rather like a gallery where you could walk around and look at the various exhibits for hours. The girl also said that at such speeds, their entire barony would simply go out into the street, and they would not have even a small space left. Before her teacher could say anything, the girl replied that she herself could not know, since she had only just arrived. However, for many years now, the fashion for collecting works of art has been emerging in their barony. The woman who had been walking behind her all this time looked at the girl and said that she had already noticed it. Indeed, the entire estate was covered in various paintings and sculptures. But at that moment, the girl suddenly saw her mother watching the new painting being installed. She immediately ran up to her and hugged her tightly. The woman immediately frowned when she saw Milan, but after she hugged her, she said that she had worked very hard in class and praised her for it. After this, Teacher Rhodes approached them. She was a rather grown-up woman with beautiful red hair. Milan's mother approached her and asked if she would like to join them for a cup of tea, as they had received a delicious selection of pastries as a gift that morning. The girl, smiling, immediately thanked the lady for such a wonderful offer, and also said that she was incredibly kind and generous. The woman then went off in a different direction, saying that she was very worried when their previous mentor suddenly resigned. However, now she was glad that they were able to find someone like Rhodes so easily. She asked if she knew for sure that the woman did not seem to be of noble birth, and meanwhile, watching the men who were standing nearby and hanging a picture, she said that this was indeed the case. Then the woman turned to her and asked with irritation in her voice what family she had served before coming to their empire. The girl felt very uncomfortable with this question, so she just stood there for a while, silently with her head down. But after that, Rhodes replied that even if she had told her, she probably would not have remembered this information. So the girl considered it necessary not to talk about it. Then suddenly, when the woman was about to answer something, a maid came up to them and, bowing, began to say something to her. As soon as Melanie's mother heard this, she was incredibly surprised. She thought about it for a while and then turned to the teacher. The woman turned to the teacher and said that she was very sorry, but they would have to reschedule this tea time because a rather important guest had arrived at their estate. After that, she immediately started running away, saying that she would send her snacks, so she just needed to wait a while. Rhodes immediately shouted after her that everything was fine. There was absolutely no need to do this, but the woman no longer heard her. At that moment, she herself was left completely alone and thought that Corrida was probably already waiting for her at home, so she would like to return there as soon as possible. In order to at least pass the time of waiting a little, Rhodes began to look around and suddenly saw a beautiful painting with a very handsome man in the center. It was a real work of art. For some time, she just stood there and looked at her, mesmerized. The girl's breath was simply taken away by such beauty. Of course, being able to collect such expensive works of art on a regular basis was something unimaginable for Rhodes. She thought many times about what this life would be like, and in the end she realized one thing, that it did not live up to her expectations at all. But Rhodes always stopped thinking about it soon after she did something she enjoyed, namely drawing. Of course, even after such a long time spent in this world, she still couldn't get used to it, because it was incredibly different from her own. As Rhodes stood and looked at the painting, which was incredibly famous and divine, she wanted to touch it to absorb all its energy. But at that moment, someone's voice was suddenly heard behind her, saying that it was better not to touch her. The girl immediately froze with her hand outstretched forward. Then she slowly turned around and saw a blond man behind her. This man turned out to be Marcus. In fact, for Rhodes, painting was nothing more than a secret that she had to hide for the rest of her life, because the paintings she made were quite explicit, and society would judge her for it. But when Marcus saw this woman with red hair, he, of course, immediately recognized her, because it was she who was drawn in the picture that they did not want to show him at first. For a while he just stood there and looked into her beautiful green eyes. But then suddenly a maid ran in and brought the cakes that the mistress had asked to give to the teacher. However, as soon as she saw Mr. Marcus, she immediately stopped and bowed to greet him. She did not expect him to come to this place. Rhodes herself stood there at that moment and was very surprised. Of course, she really hoped that this was not the very important guest that the Baroness had spoken of. The man turned out to be a notorious tycoon who suddenly appeared in Bueno one day. He was a man who rarely showed himself in public and generally stayed in his estate all the time due to his complex and distant personality. And that man was Marcus Detrain. When the woman heard his name, she immediately recognized him. Then, having greeted him, she bowed. Marcus looked at her again for a while, and then in a quiet and calm voice asked who she was anyway. The girl immediately asked him for forgiveness and, bowing again, was about to give her name. But then suddenly a butler appeared behind him. The man turned to Marcus and said that he was truly sorry. He also added that he had brought him to the wrong place, so they had to leave immediately, because the lady of this estate was waiting for them elsewhere. But Marcus looked at him at that moment and said that he hadn't actually asked him to apologize. Then he turned his head towards Rhodes again and asked what her answer would be to his question, which had been asked a little earlier. The girl, of course, was extremely surprised by this. However, bowing, she said that she was a teacher and worked for Fernanda. After that, she curtsied and said that her name was Liv Rodas. As soon as he heard this information, he was very surprised and said that it was quite interesting that she was a teacher and mentor. Then he began to carefully examine her appearance and said that he remembered her very well. Most of all, the man remembered her beautiful pink lips. In fact, Liv was the eldest daughter of an ordinary middle-class family. Both parents worked as artisans. But that was until her parents died in a sudden disaster that took the whole family by surprise. And Liv was left completely alone in this world. She was left with her sick younger sister, whose medical expenses were simply unbelievably high. The girl was always in pain, but Liv, unfortunately, could not help her in any way, because she simply did not have money for special medications that could at least slightly ease her suffering. She was the only one who knew absolutely nothing, and because of this, she had to simply pose for money that at least someone could pay. It was the artist who painted her naked body. When she thought about her situation, he always made a remark to her and asked if something was bothering her because her posture was too tense again. But of course, the girl didn't say anything. She just asked for forgiveness and continued posing. The artist then explained to her that the nude model did not necessarily have to have a typical female figure, so she could behave naturally. As soon as she met Marcus, and he said that he remembered her, she, of course, became very wary and even thought that because of this income, she could be fired from home. And this was mortally necessary because she did not yet have the money to pay for the medicine for Corrida. Plus, the rest of her debt was still too much. If she just worked as a nude model, it still wouldn't be enough to cover her expenses. She couldn't figure out when she would ever get out of this horrible situation. She was always depressed by the situation she was in, and she would have gladly given up posing nude for the artist. And then one day this man approached Liv and asked if she could show her real face, because he had never seen her before. Of course, when the girl heard this, she became very wary. Her voice suddenly began to tremble, but she tried to calm down. Liv turned to him and asked why he was even asking her about this, since there had never been such requests before. She also added that the contract stipulated that he would draw her body from the very beginning, but her face would not be visible. The man thoughtfully said that he could sell his work for a high price if she showed her face at least a little. He also added that in that case, she would never worry about not having enough money again, because they would pay a very large sum for it. But Liv, of course, immediately got angry and told him to just draw and not ask such questions anymore. The man then asked her for forgiveness and said that he was continuing to draw. But at that moment, he noticed that she had turned her head slightly, and her facial features were visible. He immediately smiled and said that she had done what he had asked, so the artist was very pleased. 10 days had passed since then, and they had to argue again. He promised that he would not show her face in the paintings, but when she saw the final result, she was outraged. The man also shouted and said that he, of course, listened to her and did not show her face. He explained that the painting depicted her silhouette in side profile, so no one would be able to recognize her identity, even if they stared at the painting for hours. The girl immediately grabbed the palette knife, which still had paint on it, and said that she would immediately get rid of the painting. She wanted to smear her face so that it would definitely not be visible. However, the artist, who was incredibly pleased with his work, immediately ran up to her and, covering the painting with his body, said that he had already sold it. As soon as the girl heard this, she was very surprised. She even dropped her tools in horror. She asked in a trembling voice, "Has he really already done this?" She looked at him with great horror and asked how he could sell a painting with her face painted on it. Horrible names, and say that she is dirty and does not deserve to exist at all. Her situation and why she was doing all this. They would call her a vulgar girl and mock her for the rest of their lives. This terrible picture flashed before the girl's eyes, but then suddenly someone knocked on their attic door and, addressing the artist, said that he had come to pick up his order. Liv immediately sensed danger. She started running straight to the door and, opening it, said that she was asking for forgiveness. However, this drawing cannot be sold because Mandel did not give her consent for this painting. The man who had already bought this work of art was a little surprised and did not even know what to say, but just stood and looked at the artist, so that they could discuss everything, and then he would give him the painting, a matter unrelated to this. Therefore, he would first report the situation to the person who had directly ordered it. He also said that his master was waiting inside the carriage, so he asked them to wait a little while he cleared the whole situation with him. Well, Liv, meanwhile, remained standing in the room. She went to the window and began to watch as the man approached the carriage where his master was sitting and talked to him about something. She was very worried. When she saw the silhouette of the man inside, she immediately thought that this was probably the same man who wanted to buy their painting. Talk him out of buying her, because she really wouldn't want her face to be hanging on someone's person now. The man finally returned. He said that his owner wanted to hear the reason why they could not sell the painting. The artist, laughing nervously, said that he could explain everything to him. But at that moment, the guy interrupted him and said that he would like to hear these explanations from the model. He would personally like to hear this reason. Marcus was indeed sitting in his carriage and waiting, because this situation really interested him. Given the nature of the work, they guaranteed that the identity of the model would remain confidential. Then Liv came closer and said that the reason why the model does not want to reveal her identity. She did not have time to finish, because the man interrupted her. The painting as originally planned, or refund the payment for the painting. Either option them quite came up would. The artist panicked at this point and said that the money had already been spent. When Liv heard this, she was very surprised and asked, shouting at him, was he really playing again and didn't even tell her about it? Marcus's assistant, sighing heavily, said that he could no longer keep his master waiting. Therefore, as soon as they made a final decision, they must visit the address that was written on the piece of paper that he handed them. She told them to make a final visit before the evening, because then a decision would have to be made. Immediately after this, Liv went outside to think for a while in private. She was breathing heavily because she knew that she was in a very difficult situation. The girl looked at the piece of paper with the address written on it. She returned home with a heavy burden on her heart because she didn't know what to do now. As soon as the door closed behind her, her sick sister immediately began to descend from above. I wondered if it was really so. This she came finally home. But when the girl came down and saw Liv, she immediately became happy. And Liv herself at that moment ran to her sister and began to hug her tightly, as if she had not seen her for an eternity. The younger sister was very surprised by this behavior and said that she must have had a very hard day, and also that she worked so hard that now she couldn't even stand on her feet. Liv thought at that moment that she needed to make the right decision because she needed money to cure her sister. She thought that if she could somehow get money, she wouldn't have to sell her painting. She just will give this one the amount that paid, and that's it. So Liv started going around very hard, selling various things, and also offering any work that she could take on for good pay from people. And so, when she came back to work at the estate, where the tutor was, her mistress noticed that something was wrong, and therefore asked if everything was okay with her. Liv was really incredibly sad because she didn't know what to do. But of course she didn't say anything to her mistress because she understood that she couldn't. When the girl looked at her expression, she knew that she could not destroy the trust she had just begun to build with her new employer. So, what to her had to restrain oneself? She smiled and said about her employer that she just wanted to let her know that Milena had learned the lessons they had given that day very well, and also that she was making great progress in her studies. Of course, as soon as the woman heard this, she was very happy, and said that her daughter was really excellent, and also that she was incredibly grateful to the teacher for such a good approach to her teaching. Of course, Liv didn't know what to do, because she couldn't find the necessary amount in such a short time, so she was simply desperate. It had been 4 whole days since that man had come. She had no choice. She had no money, and did not know what to do. So she decided to go to church in order to calm her soul a little, and perhaps find some kind of answer. The girl sat and prayed, asking God to hear her and give her some sign about what she should do. But then suddenly she heard a voice that, addressing her, said that 4 days should have been enough. He also called her name, as if he knew this girl very well. As soon as she heard this voice, she immediately became very scared. She raised her head up and saw Marcus, but did not immediately understand why he suddenly decided to talk to her. Liv sat and looked at him with a surprised and questioning look, not understanding what he even needed. But then she suddenly remembered her painting, and that the man who wanted to take it away said something about the customer. Therefore, the girl immediately came up with the idea that this customer was probably Marcus. She, unbelievable, got scared when I guessed it. Immediately after this, the man took her to his estate. She began to explain that at the moment it was difficult, but unfortunately she could not pay for the painting. Liv said she was doing everything she could to raise money. However, that the amount that she has there is not enough. The man, hearing this, immediately smiled and asked, "Is this really so?" But then he opened the canvas that was hanging on the wall. She immediately saw her naked portrait, and he asked how exactly she planned to do it. As soon as she saw this picture, she was simply horrified. She already wondered why he had this picture at all, because they had agreed not to give it away. But Marcus explained that the artist had brought it the next day, so the deal was already done. So she didn't have to worry about raising the money at all. The girl immediately started screaming and said that this painting violated the contract she had signed. Therefore, she demands that he remove it immediately. But Marcus at that moment only smiled and said that disputes between the model and the artist were absolutely none of the buyer's concern, so he was not going to get involved in their squabbles. Liv, of course, was incredibly scared. She started screaming and wondered if this was his way of showing his attention. The man said that this was indeed the case. However, the deal he had agreed to was with the model of this painting. He asked what gave the pedant's Baron family's mentor the right to tell him such things. As soon as she heard this, she immediately realized that he had found out that she was a model and knew perfectly well that she could not reveal herself. But all equals speaks these things. She assumed that perhaps he wanted to force her to give up the painting. However, Liv knew that she had nowhere to retreat, so she was going to fight until the end. Marcus is close enough to the Baron's family to visit their estate. If the Baroness were to accidentally see this portrait hanging in his estate, then, of course, it would be simply terrible. Liv knew what the consequences would be, so she had to somehow get out of this situation and come up with some kind of solution. After a short silence, the girl said that it was all because she was the model for this painting. Marcus suddenly folded his arms across his chest in disbelief and asked why he should even believe her words. He said he would like to see some hard evidence to prove the connection between the model and her. As soon as Liv heard this, she was immediately very surprised, but she said that the artist was her witness because it was he who painted her. Marcus wondered what he should do if they suddenly conspired and decided to simply deceive him in this way, because anything is possible. He also said that he heard that the model did not want her identity to be revealed, and then suddenly the girl came to him personally and said that it was her. Liv knew that this was not going to work in her favor. She knew that her words would not convince Marcus, but she wondered how she could prove that it was really her in the painting. Then suddenly she looked at her naked self and thought that maybe this was the way she could prove that it was her in the painting. If she showed him her body, then maybe he would believe her. So Liv, as she began to take off her dress, said that the proof would be if she showed the same pose right there. Of course, as soon as the girl did this, she felt incredibly uncomfortable. She didn't want to undress in front of anyone. However, she had no other choice. In order to keep her honor and job at the estate, she had to do it. Liv covered her breasts with her hands and said that that should be proof enough for him. But Marcus, looking at her with an icy voice, said that the pose was different from the one in the painting he bought, so he wanted her to stand in the same one. The girl turned her back to him and thought that she needed to hold on for a while because, after all, this embarrassment was temporary. Very soon she would prove to him that it was she in the picture and take it back. After this, her more nobody not will see. She began to remove the ribbon from her hair and thought that if this could convince Marcus, then she would do it without hesitation, because it was mortally necessary for her. When the girl let down her hair and then took it in her hand just like in the picture, she glanced at him. Marcus stood motionless at that very moment. He only watched all the elegant movements of the girl and ran his gaze over her back and beautiful body. He was silent for a while, then looked at the painting and back at the girl. After a little more time had passed, he said that she could get dressed again. Without any hesitation or delay, she immediately ran to her sweater and threw it over her shoulders. However, at that moment he came closer to her and said that in any case, she would not be able to return the painting. Liv didn't have time to put her sweater on completely. She froze in horror and said that if he gave her just a little time, she could find the money. But Man suggested skip this unnecessary talk. He said that he wanted to have this painting. So of course, even for any amount of money, he would not give it up. The girl immediately began to be indignant. She, closing her sweater on herself, told him to give this painting back because it was unfair. But then, suddenly Marcus raised the tone of his voice and said that if she really didn't want to show her face, then in that case, she could redraw it so that her face wouldn't be visible. The girl, hearing this, immediately thought about it and asked if he would really be happy with such a result. Marcus, moving away from her, said that if she brought him another painting, he could give her this version. Liv immediately replied that, of course, it was entirely possible to do so. After all, her artist had fast and professional hands, so he would draw the second copy very quickly. But at that moment, the man approached the window and began to open it, saying that he would also have one condition. Of course, the girl was a little disappointed when she heard about this because she understood that the situation could become more complicated in a second. She immediately asked what kind of condition this was, and the man, glancing at her, said that he would like to observe the entire process of work. The next day, when the girl went to the estate to have another lesson with Melanie, she was in her thoughts for a very long time. When the girl turned to the teacher, she immediately became distracted and asked what she was talking about. Melanie pushed her textbook aside and said she was distracted. It was hard, she sighed. Also added that decided learn paint. The girl explained that the teacher who would teach her to draw had already confirmed his arrival next week, so she decided to simply bring her up to speed. Liv, hearing about this, immediately smiled and said that it was good. After all, this was the first time she said that she wanted to learn something on her own. The girl lowered her head and said that it was indeed so, and also added that Marcus Dietrian is so adorable that she can't wait for her lessons. Melanie thoughtfully said that if she learned to draw, then of course she could at least once compete with Marcus in a competition for the best portrait. She also said that Marcus has an incredibly big interest in works of art, so she would really like to be like him and also be interested in this because they think it is very interesting. Liv, hearing all this, said that the last time he also mentioned that Baron Coulomb was coming to see the sculpture he had purchased. The girl confirmed this by saying that he didn't even let her near the sculpture, and also said that he was quite rude because he was very protective of it. Marcus that day, since she had heard her mother mention it. Melanie also asked what she felt when she saw him so close, and asked if she really thought the master was as wonderful as a statue that was created by God himself. Liv, when she heard all this, immediately giggled and said that she saw him literally for a while and didn't even have time to see anything there. After that, she calmed down and said that she proposed to end their meaningless conversations and return back to studying the topic they were studying. Of course, Melanie didn't like all this. She sighed heavily, fell on her textbook, and asked why people had to study at all, why they didn't have this information already in their heads. The girl only smiled at her and thought about how he had a look back then that made it impossible to take your eyes off him. But of course, she couldn't tell the girl about it. But what scared Liv most was that those eyes were filled with intentions that were impossible to understand. Of course, this made her very wary, and she would have liked incredibly much to have no more contact with this man, but unfortunately she could not. Then suddenly, Melanie turned to her after a short silence and asked if the woman already knew about one rumor that was spreading everywhere with incredible speed. As soon as Liv heard about this, she was immediately very surprised and asked what kind of rumor it was, because she really had not heard anything. Melanie in turn replied that Marcus really loves art, but there is one thing that he really collects. The girl moved closer to her teacher and whispered in her ear that he was the one collecting. As soon as Liv heard this, she froze in place. The woman did not expect to hear such a thing. Soon after, she had to go to Marcus because she had to start drawing. This man, when he came to the estate, was incredibly surprised, looking at the materials. He said that these brushes are so soft, the paint is incredibly good. The artist was delighted with all this, and he also said that all the colors are simply works of art, and he was incredibly happy that he could somehow touch this. The girl herself was standing near the window at that moment, and was not listening to him at all. Liv thought about how there were mountains and wide plains around Marcus's mansion. There, outside the window, she saw people who were taking care of the garden, and she realized that all the employees who lived in the mansion were directly Marcus's people. So she understood perfectly well that if something happened in this place, the story would not leak out to the world, and everything would be hidden until the very end. This place was like some kind of closed box to her, because really, no one would know if someone died in this estate. At that moment, Liv remembered the words of the girl who said that he had a hidden room in his basement where real mummified people were located. The girl immediately imagined this picture of herself hanging half naked on his wall like a dead animal. But she also thought that if he really did mummify her, then someone should know about it, because she works in a noble estate, and if she disappeared, it would be strange. Liv quickly gave up on these thoughts, because she could not believe that these rumors could be reality, but decided anyway, be careful on any case. She tried to calm herself down, saying that everything was fine and nothing bad would happen. The girl was sure that she needed to do this, give him the painting in which her face would not be, take the first copy, and then everything would be over. However, it still remained a mystery to her why he had even said that he would oversee this work. Marcus walked in. Hearing the artist's enthusiastic cries, he said that he had warned all the servants to prepare so that the work would be uninterrupted, so all the necessary materials had already been prepared in advance. The girl and her artist immediately turned in his direction in surprise, and Marcus, smiling, asked if he would need anything else in order to create. The artist, immediately bowing, came closer to him and said that, of course, no, he did not need anything else. In this place collected all more how enough. He also told Marcus that it was truly a great honor for him, and he would definitely create a masterpiece of his life and give it to the man as a gift. However, at that moment, Marcus stopped listening to him. He came closer to Liv and asked if she was really going to continue standing there in her clothes, even though she was supposed to be painted naked. The girl didn't have time to answer anything, when suddenly the artist ran up and said that, of course, this would not happen. Then he looked at Liv and told her to take off her clothes immediately. Of course, the girl understood perfectly well that he wanted to impress Marcus. However, on this day, his words were especially harsh, and she really didn't like it. But of course, she understood that she couldn't argue with the artist right in front of Marcus, so she gradually began to take off her clothes. But then suddenly, before the girl had time to take off her jacket, the man suddenly asked her to stop and asked if this was really their usual approach to this matter. The artist was a little surprised to hear this, but Marcus explained that he understood perfectly well that artists could be temperamental, but in his opinion, this was unacceptable behavior. The man immediately bowed before the Duke and said that he asked for forgiveness and that he would be more attentive in the future. At this point, Liv stood there and was very surprised. She couldn't believe that clients could usually criticize the artist's attitude towards the model, because she had never had that happen before. But at that moment, the girl suddenly noticed how Marcus turned his back to her so as not to watch her take off her clothes. Liv wondered if he had asked her to watch all this to find out what flaws there were in the drawing process. She was, of course, already pleased that he had turned away so as not to look. But as soon as she had suggested her theory, she realized that it was not true, because he was Marcus after all, and the man had certainly done this for his own benefit. But at that moment, the owner of the house approached a chair that stood nearby, sat down on it, and said that in that case they could begin, since everyone was ready. By that time, Liv had already begun to approach the special platform on which she was supposed to sit, and she began to take off her clothes little by little. Of course, same, she turned to the man back. She thought that painting was a tedious process anyway, so she could only hope that he would quickly get bored and just leave. Liv was practically praying that he would actually become disillusioned with the whole process and leave pretty quickly. Meanwhile, the artist had already begun drawing on the canvas. He sketched a small sketch and suddenly turned to the girl and said that she should lower her right elbow. She did so immediately, continuing to hold her hair as it had been in the first picture. As soon as the artist saw that she had done this, he thanked her and said that it would indeed be better this way. The room was incredibly quiet. No one spoke a single word except the artist, who occasionally corrected the girl. It was heard only pencil which scribbled, "by canvas." Marcus was sitting completely still in his chair at this moment, sipping wine and watching the whole process. Then suddenly the artist said that he would be able to finish the painting much faster this time because the materials were really excellent. And besides, he had already managed to get the hang of it while doing the first one. The Duke did not answer this, but only quietly whispered that if necessary, they could stay longer. However, at that moment, Marcus suddenly dropped the glass on the ground. The girl, very frightened, immediately turned around to see what had happened. The artist was able to react very quickly and immediately ran up to His Highness, asking if everything was okay with him. The Duke, looking down at the broken glass and spilled wine, said that his hand had slipped a little. That's all. The artist immediately began to run out of the room, saying that he would go out and call the servant to clean everything up. The girl immediately became frightened, but she was unable to stop him. That was why she was alone with Marcus at that moment. She sat motionless, half naked, and waited for what would happen next. Even though she had shown her naked body before, she still felt awkward being alone with Marcus. Then suddenly she glanced back and saw that the Duke's eyes were directed straight at her. This to her became very even awkward. Without saying a single word, she turned around again. Her whole face was red, and she no longer held her hair with her hand, but covered her body. She was very uneasy about the thirst and attention with which he was watching her, and she didn't understand why. But the girl tried to calm herself down by thinking that Marcus's gaze felt as if he was touching her. He looked so intently that she could practically feel his hands on her neck. At that moment, her imagination suddenly ran wild. She imagined Marcus coming up behind her, putting his arm around her waist and kissing her. Because of this, to her, became more and more awkward. However, she had to break away from her thoughts, because at that moment, the artist returned. He asked for their forgiveness and said that he could not find a single servant. Marcus, rising from his seat, said that they should finish this time and continue the next day. As soon as the artist heard this, he was very surprised and said that he had only just concentrated and was ready to work for a few more hours. Liv herself turned to look at Marcus's reaction, but he didn't react at all. He just walked out the door, which meant that his decision was firm and unshakable. Some time passed since then. The girl again dressed in her previous uniform and went together with the artist away from the estate. They were silent for a while as they walked. Liv suddenly looked around and said that it was really strange because there was absolutely no one around. The artist at this point said that this was exactly what he had meant. He assumed that most likely everyone had gone out so as not to disturb them while they worked, but he had not even been able to spot a single mouse that might have run past. Liv became wary and asked the artist if he thought it was strange. The man immediately asked why he should find it strange, and the girl explained that when the glass of wine fell, it did not seem like an accident. It felt more like he just dropped it on purpose because he had something in mind. As she walked down the stairs, the girl also said that there was not a single servant in such a large mansion, and she found this very strange. But the artist seemed completely relaxed. He said that perhaps Marcus simply liked silence and therefore did not hire many workers so that they would not disturb him in solitude. The man also said that although there had been a mistake, it had not really interfered with their drawing sessions, so he suggested that she not dwell on it too much. Liv thought at that moment that the man had indeed been quietly watching, as they had agreed from the very beginning. But she didn't understand why she still had some strange feeling despite all this. The artist told her to hurry up because he was already impatient to get home, and Marcus meanwhile watched them leave. Liv herself realized at that moment that she had somehow managed to attract the attention of something vile and sinister. However, despite all her doubts and worries, the work continued. She would come to Marcus's estate and wait for her to be painted. Meanwhile, he simply sat and constantly watched the process, but sometimes he would interrupt their work, pretending that he had made a mistake. For example, he once knocked over a vase of flowers. Liv tried to explain to the artist that something was wrong because he was constantly interrupting their work. She was embarrassed by the fact that several days had passed and the drawing was not even finished, and she did not want it to continue like this. The girl would like nothing more than to quickly get over it and forget about it. But the man told her that he would try to work even faster, so she shouldn't worry about it. In fact, when they first started doing all this, the girl was absolutely sure that they would be able to finish it quickly. But everything turned out differently than she expected. A lot of time has passed since then, and now Mel's teacher hasn't come to her birthday party. As soon as the girl saw her, she immediately became happy and thanked her for it. Woman greeted her and congratulated her on her birthday birth. Of course, Liv came only because she couldn't ignore this invitation. However, she felt very uncomfortable, because absolutely all the guests who were present there looked at her askance. The girl understood that she had to stay behind and get away from there as quickly as possible. But then suddenly, when she was about to walk a little, she did not notice and bumped into a dark-haired man. He told her to be careful, and Liv apologized and moved away from him, but she never looked at the stranger. The guy suddenly asked in surprise, "Are you really Madame Rodas?" The girl realized that he knew her, so she looked at this guy. He said with a smile on his face that he was very glad that they were finally able to meet. After that, he realized that he had not introduced himself. So he said hello and said that his name was Camille Marcel. Liv, meanwhile, shook her head and said that he was probably Melanie's new art teacher. Camille smiled and said that Mela doesn't often brag about her regular teacher, so he really wanted to meet her one day. He also added that he was incredibly happy to finally do so. Liv smiled and thanked him for his kind words and said that she was also very pleased to meet him. When she called him formally, he asked her to call him simply by his first name in the future, but the girl replied that she could not do this because it was rude and disrespectful of her. Camille then interrupted her mid-sentence and said that he also actually wanted to call her just Liv, so he thought it would be fair. The girl stood there at that moment very surprised and did not understand why this man was behaving as if they had known each other all their lives, despite the fact that they had just met. They were silent for a while, and then Liv apologized, saying that since this was their first meeting, she thought it was necessary to observe etiquette, so she would call him whatever she saw fit. Camille waved his hand and said that if he had caused her any inconvenience, he apologized. He was truly sorry, and also added that he had gotten a little ahead of the events. He also said that he really wanted to ask her for advice on teaching methods so that he could find the best approach for Melody. Liv looked at him very surprised and said that she didn't have any specific teaching methods that she could share with him. She just did it the way she thought best, that's all. But the man persisted and asked if she could help him with the boundaries he needed to maintain in his training. The guy explained that this was his first student, and he really wanted to be careful in everything so as not to cause Melody discomfort. Camille also replied that if a personal meeting would be too much of a burden for her, she could send some advice by letter. When Liv heard all this, she realized that there might indeed be some worrying aspects to teaching for a male teacher. So she said that if this was related to Melanie, she thought she could share some advice. The guy, upon hearing about this, immediately became happy and asked if he could then find out her address so that they could discuss everything. As Liv watched his expression, she realized that he didn't seem like a bad person. Judging from the rest of their conversation, he was actually quite nice, so she doubted that giving him the address would be a bad idea. So, having written her address on a piece of paper, she gave it to him. But at that moment they suddenly heard some strange sounds behind them. As soon as the guy and the girl turned to the side, they immediately saw a multitude of ladies who had gathered in front of one man. Taking a closer look, the teacher recognized who it was. Sure enough, Marcus had come to the party, and he was immediately surrounded by ladies and men who came up to greet him. She watched this whole event in surprise and could not understand what he was doing in this place. Camille, smiling, said that it was quite surprising because he did not think that he could like such crowded places. After all, he had never come to this kind of event before. Liv turned to him and asked, "Do you really know a lot about Marcus?" The man replied that he didn't really. He did know some things, but it wasn't that important information. Smiling, Camille also said that he knew as much as everyone else, nothing more. The girl, hearing about this, became very interested, because in fact she had heard and knew very little about this man, so it would be very good for her to find out more. At that moment, they suddenly heard conversations coming from the aristocrats. One of the ladies said that the fact that Marcus had come was already the biggest birthday present for Melanie. Then her mother came up and told the man that he had no idea how much her daughter wanted to see Marcus, so this was a great joy for her. The girl herself lowered her head at that moment because she was a little embarrassed. And Liv, watching all this, thought that she was happy that her wish had come true, because she really wanted it. But at that moment she heard a lady talking behind her. She asked her friend, "Did Marcus really come just to celebrate the birthday of the Baron's daughter?" Another replied that she doubted it very much, since there must have been some other reason. They thought that perhaps the Baron had done something to make this happen, because when they looked at the excited expression on Melanie's father's face, they got the impression that he was trying to sell his daughter to this man. When Liv heard all this, she immediately understood that Melanie would probably be upset to hear these words. After all, she had so hoped to meet Marcus, and now everything went completely differently than she could have expected. People were saying that the Baron no longer knew exactly where his place was, since he had decided to try to marry his daughter to the Duke. They considered this very unacceptable and even impudent. Then suddenly Liv remembered how one woman she used to work for yelled at her and told her that she should know her place. This employer did not understand how a simple mentor could try to seduce the eldest son of a viscount. But of course, this did not happen. The girl was simply doing her job. She even hit poor Liv and said that she would make sure that she never showed her impudent face in the capital again. As soon as the girl remembered all this, she felt a little sick, so she began to lose consciousness. But Camille was nearby and managed to catch her so that she did not fall. When he saw that she was conscious, he immediately asked if she was okay. Liv, still holding her head, replied that she was fine. It was just a moment of dizziness, that's all. He shouldn't worry so much. She started to move away from him and said that she had to leave immediately. He wanted to say something else, but he didn't have time because the girl was moving very quickly. At that very moment, Marcus, who had been standing surrounded by many ladies until now, was watching only Liv and became very interested in her condition. And so, 3 days passed from that moment, and the girl received a letter from her employer, which said that Melanie's health was not bad, so she would not be able to continue her lessons for some time. It also said that they would definitely write when classes could resume. Liv, after reading this letter, became a little worried. She could not understand what had happened to Melanie. She thought that if the classes did stop and the tuition stopped, she didn't know how she would manage her living expenses for the next month. Of course, she was very worried. But then suddenly, Liv noticed that her sister came down from below and asked, "Does Corita really need something?" The girl turned to her, smiled, and said that not at all. She was fine and didn't need anything. But as soon as she said these words, she immediately began to cough very hard, so that even while choking, Liv, of course, was very scared and ran up to the girl. She asked if she was okay, but then she suddenly saw that her sister was coughing up blood, and this scared her even more. She sat Corita down on a chair and asked where her medicines were. The nurse replied between coughs that, in fact, all the medicine had disappeared. Liv, hearing this, immediately looked at the table where she had just been looking at her savings. It was all the savings they had left to live on, but when she looked at her sister's condition, she no longer had any doubts about what to do. The girl quickly grabbed a few bills from the table. Then she took her coat and, leaving, told her sister to wait a little, because she would be back very soon. Liv ran to the drugstore as quickly as she could. Once inside, she turned to Uncle Aubin. The man, who was reading a newspaper at the time, immediately put it down and, looking at Liv, replied that he was surprised that she had come to him. But the girl tried to get her breathing back in order and said that she really needed medicine and incredibly urgently. The man climbed onto the top bunk and said that first she had to catch her breath. Rushing would not result in the drugs taking effect immediately, so she needed to calm down. When the girl noticed the newspaper the pharmacist was reading, she immediately asked what it was. The man explained that it was news that a new medicine had recently been discovered. When the girl heard about it, she immediately became very interested. The man continued to pour some medicine into her bag and said that it was indeed so. It was said to be very effective for people with the same illness as Corita, and it could even be a way to cure her completely. Liv immediately put the money on his desk for the medicine and asked where she could get it. The pharmacist, continuing to pour out the medicine for her, said that it probably wouldn't make it to a small pharmacy like ours, tucked away in a corner, and the price would be several times higher, so she simply wouldn't be able to afford it even if they did. The girl, of course, was very upset about this. She did not understand how this could be because they could barely afford the cost of those drugs that practically do not help. And here it is even more expensive. But at that moment, the man handed her a bag and said that she worked for a noble family, so perhaps she could somehow take advantage of their connections. "That's it," he said. "She knows that with her money there's little that can help. The medicines that simply prevent Corita's disease from getting worse are the ones she buys." In conclusion, he said that no one knows. Perhaps she will be able to attract the attention of one of these worthy employees and turn her life around for the better. Liv put the medicine in her bag, and the pharmacist told her that she couldn't take care of her sick sister alone forever. He also asked her not to close herself off so much and to find someone nice to share the burden with. He said that she needed a man who would also be on her side and could fight with her. Then all would fine. Liv thought about it, but after that she said that it was time for her to go, and also that they would see each other next time. Finally, the man said that she couldn't ignore him forever and should think about it seriously, even though once she should listen to him advice. As the girl ran through the streets towards her home, she thought that she couldn't be weak. She had to stay strong for the sake of her family, who remained with her. She had to be strong for her sister, but then suddenly the girl did not notice the stone and twisted her leg. Thus, she could not stay on her feet and just fell. The people around her completely ignored her. Medicines fell on land, and some even got enough sleep. When Liv looked up to see what was going on, she saw that one of the men was about to step on her medication. She immediately screamed and started running towards him, telling him to be careful. Then, with trembling hands, the girl began to collect all her medicines for her sister. She cried because she simply did not have any strength left to endure all this. Some time had passed since then. She had already been home, helped her sister take the medicine, and put her to rest so that she could gain strength. After that, Liv walked through the dark streets and thought that her head was spinning because of all the events that had happened. That's right. That's why she went out to at least a little to unwind. It had been an incredibly long and difficult day for her, but she was grateful that the medication had worked a little, and she was able to overcome at least one obstacle with her sister. But after such a hard and long day, there was only one place left for her to go and rest a little. Of course, that place was the church. That was where Liv was heading. As soon as the girl opened the doors, she immediately saw empty benches and the beautiful silence that she loved so much. She walked slowly to one of the benches and sat down. For a while, the girl just sat there and was silent, but soon she turned to God, as she always did. But in reality, Liv didn't believe in God, and all because it was God who could never hear her prayers and somehow help. It was God who allowed this horrible situation to happen to her family. He didn't help her in any way, didn't give her any support or faith that he should have. Because of this, it was very difficult for her to believe in him. Ever since she was forced to enter a prestigious boarding school as a poor commoner with nothing, she has become accustomed to fighting alone. When her parents died, and when Liv went through terrible things in the places she went to tutor, God was the only one who wasn't on her side, not supported her, and now all she has left is her faith in her sister. But Karina is trying to take even that away from her. She is fighting, of course, but this fight only makes her morale worse. The only thing Liv wanted was someone to comfort her, someone who could support her through the hardships she was going through, someone who would truly support her, so that she wouldn't fall to the ground from exhaustion and stop fighting. At that moment, the girl even started to cry because she felt incredibly sorry for herself. After all, she would not want to be in such a situation, but she simply has no choice. She would like to have a shoulder next to her that she could lean on in a difficult situation. Then suddenly, immersed in her thoughts, she did not even immediately notice that some paper had been placed on her lap. Opening her eyes, she saw it and was immediately very surprised. When she looked more closely, she realized that it was a handkerchief. The girl immediately began to look around, and as soon as she turned her head to the left, she saw Marcus in front of her. His appearance surprised her very much. She asked in a trembling voice what he was doing here. Then suddenly the man said in a cold and distant voice that God could listen. However, he nothing not guarantees in return. And the power to achieve something is already embedded in people from the very beginning, so they must fight and necessarily act. As soon as he looked at her, he immediately smiled and told her that in that case, she should pray to him because he could help. Seeing her surprised expression, he said that no one knows, but miracles can happen. Liv sat there looking at him in surprise. Of course, those words sounded too sweet and pleasant. She even thought that perhaps Marcus really wanted to answer her prayer, which even the gods had rejected, but she not was in this absolutely sure. But if this is just an excuse to make fun of her because he is not interested in her, then it would be too rude on his part, and the girl would not withstand such a blow. Then suddenly Marcus turned around and started to walk away, saying that she always made people wait, and that was what irritated him the most. Liv realized that she was wasting her chance, So she stood up from her seat and screamed that she really needed the money. As soon as the boy heard about this, he immediately froze in place. He did not answer anything, but only stood. Then the girl sighed heavily, lowered her head and said that she asked for forgiveness for what she had just said, because it was wrong. She also added that if she could take on other modeling jobs while doing this one, if he could just cancel the clauses of the exclusive contract that was imposed, then perhaps her situation would improve. After saying these words, she just stood there and was silent. She didn't know what would happen next, because she even thought that these statements could offend Marcus. But the girl hoped for the best. Then suddenly she heard him turn around and start to come closer to her. She thought that perhaps this man could use her momentary weakness as a way to take revenge. Then Marcus spoke up and asked if she would like to take on any extra work to earn more money. How could he say that if she took it on, he would be able to compensate her generously? Liv, hearing about this, was very surprised and asked, "Is he really serious?" After all, she already thought that he would start to mock her, but then he offers an alternative. As he moved closer to the exit, he told her to return the handkerchief with the answer during her next shift. Then, he walked out the door and slammed it behind him, without saying a word. Liv was left standing in the church, completely alone. She was shocked by this turn of events and did not know what to do now. Of course, she needed the extra work, but she didn't know what Marcus was thinking about, because it could be something bad. She clutched the handkerchief in her hand, and at that moment, it seemed to her that her whole life was moving in a completely unexpected direction, and she didn't even know whether it was good or not. The next day, Liv made a decision, and when she came to Marcus's estate, she handed him the handkerchief. The girl sat motionless in her place and said that she would like to give him the handkerchief she had received from him in church. Marcus, meanwhile, took out his cigars, and the girl said that regarding the additional work he had proposed, she would like to hear the details first. The man, breaking off the end of his cigar so he could light it, said he couldn't give her all the details yet until she said she would. Looking her straight in the eye, he said that he didn't want to spread her unnecessary chatter at all. And besides, various rumors about him could start to spread, and he didn't need that at all. The girl lowered her head. She had expected such a turn of events, of course, but now she did not know what decision to make. Marcus, meanwhile, sat quietly waiting for her answer, smoking his cigar, looking the girl straight in the eyes. After some thought, Liv finally made a decision, although she was not so ready for it. It was hard, she sighed, said that agree. Marcus then immediately smiled, and lighting a cigarette, said that in that case, one person would wait for her outside. She should listen explanations and sign contract. Looking back at the girl, he smiled and said that he looked forward to her working with him. Liv then went down to the office on the floor below where Marcus's assistant was sitting, and he handed her some documents to study. When she read it all carefully, she was very surprised and asked, "Is this really going to be her extra work?" The man nodded his head in agreement and said that was indeed the case. She had to be in the same room with Marcus, naked,